Hello, I'm Farish Noor, and here we are at a question and answer session sponsored and promoted by Gerakbudaya. Now, that's an important question, and it's a question that I think should be taken very seriously, particularly by academics in the social sciences. Now, let's start with the idea of overthinking itself. Now, obviously, in this case, when we talk about overthinking, we are not using the term the way it's used in, say, psychology, where overthinking is a condition where someone ruminates. You think too much about something and you get into this mental loop that actually contributes to depression, stress, and anxiety. Well, we're not talking about that kind of overthinking, but we're talking about overthinking in the sense of analyzing human phenomena to the point where the analysis can actually go well beyond the phenomena itself. It doesn't have any explanatory power anymore. Now, this is one of the perennial questions that all social scientists from domains like sociology, anthropology, history like myself, or even political economy have to seriously consider. Now let's start to break down the term a bit. Overthinking, what does it mean? Well, it's a concept that has both utility but also contains a trap. It contains a trap in the sense that it can be used in a particular way to dismiss analysis, in the sense that, someone analyzes human phenomena, say a historical event, and a person who may disagree with that analysis can simply say, oh, you're simply overthinking, you're reading too much into it. Well, here's the problem. All analysis requires us to think beyond the thing itself. So overthinking already implies that one is thinking over or beyond a thing. But on the other hand, if we were not able or inclined to think beyond the thing itself, then it's very difficult to do any kind of analysis. So this is the dilemma that many of us in academia have to deal with. And it's going to be an issue for all academics who do any kind of analysis. Let me give you an example. One can see a simple thing, mundane thing that many of us are familiar with. Let's say a traffic jam. So you see a traffic jam. You're on the road, you want to go somewhere, and there's just too many cars and the cars are not moving. So at the surface level of simple material phenomena, what do we see? We see cars, we see a lot of cars, we see cars not moving, and that might be because the road is too narrow or what have you. Now, if we were just to leave it at that, that would be a correct description of the thing. But it doesn't tell us much. It doesn't tell us much. Because we have to remember that the idea of a traffic jam itself is already an abstraction. Because we never actually see a traffic jam. We see cars, we see the road, we see many cars not moving. Where is the traffic jam? The traffic jam is an abstraction. It is an abstract concept that we as language users develop to describe a particular situation. So in a sense, you're already overthinking. The moment we use these abstract concepts like democracy, traffic jam, ecological disaster, environmental pollution, these are all abstract concepts. We never see the things themselves, but it is a collection of things, perception of things that allows us to begin the process of abstraction in order to have general ideas. That in itself is already the beginning of overthinking. But let's say someone wanted to do, a deeper analysis and say, well, the persistence of traffic jams in any particular city is symptomatic of maybe poor urban planning or too much emphasis on private transport rather than public transport, or is a legacy of a certain kind of political economy that favors private vehicle owners rather than pedestrians, that would be a valid analysis. But that requires us to overthink. We think beyond. So I'm not particularly worried about the need to think beyond material, objective reality in order to have analysis. But of course, there is always the attendant problem. As we do analysis, as we read beyond in order to give our subjective analysis to things, whether they are historical phenomena, political phenomena, economic phenomena, there will always be the question of how far can you go? How far can you go? If someone were to say, the persistence of traffic jams in many developing countries is a legacy of, the inheritance of colonial modes of production or colonial mindset that sees development in purely capital-driven terms, okay, that's fine, I think. But if you want to go beyond that, how far can we push it? Can you say, for instance, that, this is symptomatic of a post-colonial mindset where post-colonial societies do not understand traffic rules or whatever? Now, that's where it gets sketchy. That's where it gets a bit tenuous. And I think this is always going to be an issue for those of us who are in the social sciences. We can't escape the need to analyze, because that's what we do. We analyze documents, phenomena, historical events. We analyze, but in the process of analyzing, we are thinking beyond the thing in itself. That becomes a necessity for the work that we do. But how far one pushes it, I think, has less to do with truth claims in themselves, but rather they are circumscribed by parameters that are set normatively. In other words, within the academic community and within the broader reading public, they will develop eventually a kind of common consensus as to how far one can go in doing analysis, beyond which people say, well, okay, that's a bit ridiculous. That's a bit ridiculous. You're going too far, you're reading too much into it. And then we move into the domain of conspiracy theories and what have you. So this is, I think a feature of academic life, a kind of academic work that we do. And I don't think we can escape it, but it is very important for all of us, both in the academic community and in the community of readers, to be alert to this process, which I think is part and parcel of academic production itself. So unfortunately, I can't give a happy answer, I can't give a simple answer. There's no solution to it, because it's not really a problem, but it is an attendant feature of our work, and it is part and parcel, I think, of learning to think and write academically, that one has to learn, be acquainted with the norms of academic discourse, academic writing, and academic production. So thank you for that question. It's a very important question. It's a perennial question. It's a question that will not go away, but it is an important reminder for all of us, particularly academics like myself, that we need to always be aware of what we're actually doing. We never simply, give facts. We present facts. And in the process of presenting facts, presentation necessarily involves selection, and the selection bias and what have you. And we need to be aware of this all the time. It makes you a better student. It makes you a better scholar. It makes you a better academic. So it's something that we need to be constantly aware of. An interesting question. I'm not trained as a historian, and I've made this clear. My background is actually a mixed one, because my educational background was multidisciplinary. I did a double degree in both philosophy and in literature, and of course in philosophy, you learn linguistics, semiotics, philosophy of language, eventually discourse analysis. And in literature, of course, literature is not a homogeneous field either. There are all kinds of literature, historical literature, romantic literature, and what have you. And from there, I later moved on to Southeast Asia area studies. So at what point did I feel the need to study history? Well, I suppose there are 2 points. One is in my academic development, particularly when I went on to study Southeast Asia. I came to realize that one can never talk simply about Southeast Asia as something that is already fully constituted. Yeah? We never find Southeast Asia. It's not as if you open the box, oh yes, there's Southeast Asia. A region, again, it's an abstract concept, whether it's Southeast Asia, South Asia, East Asia, Central Asia, Africa, the West, whatever that means, the Americas, whatever that means. Now, when we deal with these unwieldy, large abstract concepts, there is a tendency to slip into or to slip towards a kind of mindset where we see these large abstract ideas in singular terms. And I'm very wary of that. And I think it was my philosophical background that actually made me very cautious about thinking and studying Southeast Asia as a thing. And I've been teaching the history of Southeast Asia over the last 20 years. And the first thing that I tell my students is that there isn't a thing called Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is actually a multiplicity of assorted phenomena. The history of Southeast Asia is not over, it's an ongoing project. So every day there are Southeast Asias coming into being all the time. So I suppose academically, my turning point for me when I realized that we need to study history was when I began to do Southeast Asian area studies. And that's when I realized that without understanding the complex history, or rather histories of Southeast Asia, I will never be able to fully grasp what the concept means. And that itself is also problematic. It's also slightly misleading because, the concept doesn't mean a thing. It means many things. So Southeast Asia is many things to many different people. There are more than 600 million Southeast Asians. Each Southeast Asian has a very different, a very personal experience of what Southeast Asia is for her or for him. And so we need to always be aware of that. But perhaps on a personal basis, when did I feel the need to study history? I suppose it was very early on in my teens when I went to England as a student to begin my studies in the UK. So to be in England at that time in the mid-80s, that's how old I am, to be in England in the mid-80s was a difficult process. I had never lived beyond Southeast Asia until then. And I arrived in England during the so-called dark days of Margaret Thatcher, where a new kind of economic nationalism was on the rise with the new right in England. Yeah? So today everyone talks about the resurgence of right-wing politics in England, in Europe, but actually you can date this back to the 70s and 80s. Yeah? Reaganomics in America, Thatcherism in the UK. And I think then, as a student from Malaysia, the South, as a student from a former British colony, I was struck by a number of things. Prior to going to England, I had perhaps, a somewhat rose-tinted view of England, because my knowledge of England was mainly derived from British English literature, so reading Jane Austen and Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene and people like that. And then suddenly arriving in a country that was already deeply divided along ethnic, racial, religious lines. And when, as foreigners, foreign students, we were generally made to feel that we were only there to basically spend money to keep the British education system alive. And that's what it has become. The education system in Europe basically relies a lot on foreign students to keep it going, because the state has abdicated its responsibility to take care of higher education. And so even then, as a teenager, I already began to understand the mechanics of colonial and post-colonial relations, and how we students from the third world were actually paying more for exactly the same services that European and British students were getting at university. So already then, at the age of 18, I could see that there was this unfairness in the way in which we were expected to pay more to get exactly the same thing. It would be like, a cup of coffee, and I would have to pay 5 times more for the same cup of coffee compared to a British student. Now, so at that point, then I realized, okay, here we see the gap between the North and the South, the first world and the third world, right before our eyes. And I was struck by the fact that as a student in those days, university students, we were all activists. We were all members of the National Union of Students. While there were many issues that the National Union of Students would raise, it was seldom, the issue of this unequal treatment between foreign students and domestic students was not always at the top of the agenda. And I was wondering, why is it that in the UK at the time, in the 80s, so few people were aware of the fact that these inequalities between North and South, First World and Third World, are not natural. They're not natural. They're the result of processes, and these processes were the processes of colonial capitalism. And it was then, my first teaching job was in my 20s, when I was a junior teaching assistant, lecturer assistant, when I began my PhD, and I was actually teaching decolonization. And when I was teaching decolonization to British students, doing their undergrads, I was struck by the fact that many of the Western students I was teaching were not even aware of their country's colonial past, the colonial history. I was shocked to discover British students not aware of the fact that Malaysia was once one of their colonies. Some students didn't even know that India was a colony of Britain. And I thought, how could this happen? Because history is taught. History is taught at school in England, and they should know their own country's history. And that's when I realized personally how important history is. Because if we do not know our past, we do not know our history, and how our histories are interconnected and intertwined, then we often are surprised by the situation we find ourselves in. But it should not come as a surprise. The poverty of the South, the poverty of the third world is not a surprise. It's a direct consequence of more than a century of systematic and deliberate exploitation through the mechanics of racialized colonial capitalism. So for me then personally, I suppose being in Europe and encountering this historical amnesia on a large scale was something very important. Many of you, perhaps not as old as me, may not be aware of this, but in the 80s already in England, there was already a kind of colonial nostalgia. There was something that was then called the Raj revival. You had movies like Passage to India, you had TV series like Jewel in the Crown, The Far Pavilions, all of which would present us with a glamorized and sanitized view of the British Empire in India. And even then, as students in my teens and my early 20s, I could already see that this is pure propaganda. And this propaganda is only possible when a community, when a nation doesn't know its own historical entanglement with its past. And this, in the case of the West, was an imperial past, a colonial past. And I think for me, that was when I really, on a personal level, understood that history is actually very important. It's a powerful tool, and it's very dangerous when historical erasure happens before your very eyes.